myself, since I drum, to write a dissertation, thesis about drumming, with a strangely similar title. With the inevitable colon, it had a slightly longer title. A study of kit drumming identities, practices, and learning. Because as well as playing drums, doing it, I also teach drummers. Here I am teaching one. This is actually my wife posing as a drum student. Anyway, there we are. Prior to the academic glasses. I've just had the title of it changed. Ashgate had just accepted this as a book a week ago, which is rather exciting. And I had to change the title to Being and Becoming a Drummer. And I'm not, after my research, I wasn't sure there was much of a difference between being and becoming, but it's now got an ISBN number, so there's nothing I can do about it. And I'm rather hoping I might use this picture of me for the front, because I mentioned twice in the title, so we'll see, anyway. However, I was asked to do a talk mostly about being and becoming a doctor. This is me becoming a doctor in February this year. February? April? When was it? April. I should know that. Yes. I love the accounts there. And I've got a matching tie, matched the blue. I was so proud of myself. So, conveniently, as part of my research, I created a model of identity. And that's kind of what the talk's about too. So I'm just going to talk you through that very quickly. It was called the snowball self, which for those of you sitting anywhere near the back, it's at the bottom there. It would have been to have heading at the top, but I didn't. So I'm going to read you, I wrote it really well in my thesis, so I'm going to read you a little bit from that. It explains much better than I could without it. I propose a metaphor to describe how identity realization and learning realization, these guys at the top here, work together. I bought this specially for the presentation too, that's quite exciting. Always wanted one. Sorry. So I propose a metaphor to describe how they work together, the self as a snowball that one can either allow to roll freely on and off the meandering mountain pieces of life, or that one or another can guide along the slopes and surrounding terrain. When we guide the snowball along in a direction of our choosing, we know whence we will gather the snow, identities and learning, and may have a good idea of what that snow is like, or at least we have every intention of finding out. When another person guides the ball on our behalf, or we take a surprising turn, however, we may discover that we have acquired unexpected learning or identity snow. If we reach an easy, gentle slope, we may choose to run alongside our snowball, allowing it to roll freely, bouncing off the occasional mogul, gathering no snow as the surface hardens, or acquiring material of a type unnoticed by us until we turn around to glance at our snowball self and discover that it looks different than the last time we checked. As the snowball rolls, different parts of it will become visible, some more or less so than others, and some parts we may choose to reveal more or less of, according to context. It is also likely that snow will fall off, becoming covered up or be forgotten about, and may be replenished by a return to a particular area of the piece. The snowball self is composed from identities and learning experiences, of passive and active identity realization, passive and active learning realization. These in turn inform and are informed by practices. So identity realization and learning realization together make the snowball self. So thank you for sticking with me. So to talk through these just very quickly, active identity realization, this is when you go about being something. For instance, being a drummer, it's when you play the drums, or buy some drums, anything you do that's involved in being a drummer. Whereas the passive identity realization is the kind of aha moment when you discover something about yourself. For instance, I moved to London 11 years ago to become rich and famous with my rock band. Didn't. And then, because I was teaching at a primary school instead, which was really good fun, it turned out. And I remember, it was about 2 years after I started working there, and one of the kids said to me, "Mr. Smith," and I went, "Oh my goodness, I'm a teacher." It hadn't really occurred to me until, despite the fact I'd been being a teacher for 2 years, I hadn't kind of got that sort of passive identity realization, I'd call it. The best thing about these two, passive and active identity realization, spelled P-A-I-R, it's a pair, and there are two of them. I couldn't believe it. I was running around Highgate Woods one day going, P-A-I-R, it's a pair. So anyway, it was very exciting for me. So the active learning realization is when you go about learning stuff, the things you do when you turn up to a doctoral graduate conference, for instance, that kind of thing. Or when you read books, anything you do that goes about learning. Whereas this guy, the passive learning realization, that's the stuff that that you don't sort of know that you're knowing, or know how. It's when you realise that you've learned something, when you understand, perhaps. For instance, one of the drummers I interviewed for my study said to me, he said, "I'm not very good at reading music." Now, no one had told him that, but it's something he sort of figured out. So I got sort of thinking about the stuff that our students, and me actually, what they learn that we don't expect them to be learning, or that they don't know they're knowing. Anyway, that sort of thing. So altogether, it helps form the snowball self, which contains some meta-identities down here, The principal meta-identity for a drummer, I said, is being a drummer. So these are kind of big identities in which you have little small contextual ones. I might be a rock drummer, I might be a jazz drummer. I'm a drummer tonight, but I'm not playing. I'm also a teacher, which overlaps with the drumming when I'm teaching people to play drums. I'm a husband, which becomes plainly apparent when I'm at conferences for longer than I would like to be away from home, that kind of thing. So all these things overlap, you know, and we did these things in different contexts. So there we are. That's maybe the last you'll hear of my research. Along the way, I found it really helpful to think about identity in terms that other people used, such as biography. This is a really helpful way to think of identity for me. And narrative, which is broadly similar, but just these different words kind of help think about what identity is. And explain the data I was finding as well. And as a processual kind of a thing, like you don't have an identity, it doesn't stay there, it's a process. I think the snowball is actually better than the process. Although I was told actually by some cheeky Texans that my snowball would melt where they came from, so it was dashed. And also trajectories, this idea of kind of an identity going in a particular direction or other. So learning, I also discovered slide transitions recently, so I like the kind of flippy, I love that stuff. Because for ages I couldn't figure out how to do it. I used to have presentations that are about a mile long with I used to copy and paste, it's ridiculous. Anyway, now, transitions are great. So, different ideas about learning. This idea of enculturation is my favourite word at the moment, I think. Yes. Because it seems to cover everything, because you have to learn in a culture or in cultures. So it's kind of learning anything from the culture you're in. Depending on whose work you read, it can mean different things. So there's acculturation. But I like it because it seems to be a really good way of looking at what learning is. And it explained a lot of what I was seeing. This continuum was interesting. A continuum of notions of learning. For instance, there's often you get a sort of polarised formal and informal, and that things happen kind of in between, and the mixture of, and the idea of a continuum, which I rather like. The same man talks about these things, the hidden, tacit, or implicit teacher. So that, again, that kind of notion of the passive learning realisation, where you're learning stuff kind of accidentally, or without realising it, maybe. And also there's a colleague of mine talks about this unconscious accumulation, which I quite like the idea of. And it's a bit like the snowball gathering snow accumulation. So I quoted him. Identity and learning seem to me to be very much connected. And I found a couple of great quotes to back me up. This idea about creating histories of becoming seems quite cool. He's talking about learning, this guy, really big learning theorist. But I was reading an identity journal, someone not talking about learning at all. They said this: identities are constructed by a developmental process that involves the actualization or full use of one's abilities or potential. And that sounds a lot like education. So someone who wasn't even looking for education was kind of finding that identity is basically about learning who we are. It's kind of a bit obvious, but also quite nice to come to understand, I think, for me. It's a learning question. For about the first 18 months of my PhD, this question kept popping up. People would ask me this, and I was wondering too. Because I knew it was about drums, but I knew it wasn't a PhD in drums. And people were going, what's it in? And I was going, I don't know. It's at the Institute of Education. So is it an education? And I said, well, maybe, because it's about drumming, but it's kind of what we do and who we are. And it's all the Institute is also kind of social research, so it might be that. So I asked Lucy, my supervisor, and she said that it was in the sociology of music and music education, and sort of cryptically said this. And I sort of went, yes, that's right. One's a field, and I didn't really know which was which, but now I do, I think. So the field was music education, and the discipline through which I was studying was sociology. But sociology seemed like such a big thing, and that also could have been a field, actually. However, it's a field of music education through the discipline of sociology, probably, at least it is today. And it was nice to understand, because then I could tell people it was in the sociology of music and music education, which they didn't really understand, but at least it was an answer. Neither did I. So Bill Bruford is my drumming hero. He just actually hung up his drumsticks, metaphorically speaking, last Christmas. He decided he had enough, and he now does masterclasses to talking about the drum. Anyway, he's a hero of mine for his drumming, and also for the title of an album he brought out a little while ago, Apart and Yet Apart. This was a really interesting thing for me. I love the music, but this notion of being a part of and yet apart from different things kept cropping up with identity of me and the people I was interviewing. So here's a picture of the album cover, and I'm going to play you a brief snippet of the first track. just before it goes mad. But anyway, we haven't got time for that, unfortunately. Maybe fortunately. So, anyway, I'm back onto the this is a question that I thought I knew the answer to a long time ago, since I'd learnt about music and learned music, and I taught music. I thought that's what music education was. But it turns out it isn't necessarily. It is in this country, but I started going to conferences a lot in America. We were talking about presentations, you were talking about presentations. And because I was doing this doctorate part-time, I could never get into any of the seminars and stuff, so I thought, I didn't have anyone to really discuss my work with, so I went to loads of conferences, basically to see if any of it held any water, because I didn't know. And not mixed responses, but that was the kind of the dialogue I had about my research. Anyway, music education in the UK is one thing, very different thing in the US. I applied for a job in the US doing music education, thinking it was teaching people music, but it's not. It means teaching people who teach people music. It was teaching music teachers, because they have, if you go and study music at university, you study bassoon or the drum kit or whatever. If you study music education, you study teaching music. So, now I know, so I don't apply for those jobs anymore. What kind of ethnology? Lucy told me it was sociology, but I wasn't so sure. Because I've been reading about identity, and all these identity people were definitely psychologists. So I thought, perhaps I'm into psychology. It seemed to fit, because it was like, who am I in my head? Who do I understand myself to be? But Lucy assured me it was sociology, and she had to sign off the draft, so, Then I came across these people and thought, social psychology, well, that's all right, that's kind of like a mix. It's about who you are in the context. Quite like that. This is the best one. I like this, sociological social psychology. If there was ever a way to hedge your bets. Brilliant. So I like these people. There were Stets and Burke said, we are sociological social psychologists. I mean, who says that? So it occurred to me that I might be doing ethnomusicology as well, a little bit. And I sort of explored this word because it sounded quite cool, and I'd heard it. I'd heard of it. And I mentioned it at a few conferences when I dropped it into conversation to see what happened. And I was hanging out with some sociologists one day in Cardiff, and they all said, oh, that sounds like ethnomusicology. I said, really? That's interesting, because I thought maybe it was. And we had a discussion about it, and it seems that maybe, sometimes the difference is just the spelling. Other times it's the methodology, and sometimes it depends who's reading and who's reviewing it for the journal. So there's a bit of that in it, and I think what we ended up with was a sociological thing with elements of ethnomusicology for the purists. And then the killer for me was this one, cultural psychology. And I even got a t-shirt made that said on it, yes, I'm a cultural psychologist, just to wear at a conference. I believe there's a video of me wearing that on YouTube. I'm sure there is, actually. I was so proud of the t-shirt. Anyway, this was really cool. There was a book came out at the end of last year by Margaret Barrett called A Cultural Psychology of Music Education. Not the cultural psychology, because we have to be careful, but it's A Cultural Psychology of Music Education. And it seems to be all about people learning and being musicians in various social and cultural contexts. So it was brilliant. So I have had to thank for deciding to get the t-shirt made, but I handed my final thing had been handed in by then, and it was sociology. But I'm thinking of putting the cultural psychology thing into my book. I might just slip it in, see if Ashgate noticed. Anyway, who am I today? This is a question that cropped up an awful lot, the apart and yet apart thing. IOE doctoral conferences were great. I went to 4 of them, the poster ones and the speaking ones, and they were really handy because it was kind of obvious that everyone was there to talk about their research as a doctoral student here. Really good. Everyone would say, what are you studying? And be genuinely interested, or at least pretend to be, which is great. However, I went to the Society for Research on Identity Formation conference in Chicago, thinking these people must be the same as me because they're talking about identity. But they all turned out to be really interested in Mexican immigrants to the US and adolescents, which is fine, but had nothing to do with what I was talking about. And they were suggesting we should hold a paradigm party to decide what identity was, and I didn't fit in at all. But it was interesting nonetheless. They accepted my paper for whatever reason. Then there was the ICMPC, the International Conference on Music Psychology and Cognition, which sounded perfect as well. But it turned out actually they were mostly neuroscientists and statisticians, and I couldn't really have anything to do with them. But again, strangely accepted my paper. It was nice to go to Italy for the weekend anyway. And this was the International Association for the Study of Popular Music. These were great people. This is where I have a conversation about ethnomusicology. These conferences are fantastic because they're about popular music, so you have to go to loads of gigs and drink a lot, which is good. And the International Society for Music Education, these were good, and I sort of fitted in there, but not completely, because they don't do much popular music, and that's all I do, so they're kind of curious about how this drummer works, you know. I've been back, and it worked. Sociology of Music Education, this is pretty good. I felt pretty at home at this conference, even though it was in Ireland. These people were very accepting, so I just felt like a pop. Very nice. And my supervisor, Lucy, was presenting the keynote presentation of the first one of these I went to, so I sort of had to fit in. I thought. Then there was the Suncoast Music Education Research Symposium in Florida. I was quite excited because it was in Florida, and I thought that'd be a great place to go give a paper, because it's probably really warm, and it was February, and it was warm. But again, this is where I discovered the whole music education thing in the States and the UK. Well, I got hints about it. It wasn't until I applied for the job I realised I was barking entirely the wrong tree. But yeah, it was a nice place to go. Then there was Research in Music Education, a conference that happens in Devon every couple of years, which is good, but everyone there seems to be a bit too much for my taste into the research and a bit less into the results and what it all means for actually teaching. Maybe I went to the wrong presentations, but I felt a bit kind of on the fringes of this one. But again, nice part of the world. I got to spend a day on Dartmoor, after Exmoor, in fact, since it was Exeter. Lovely, bought some cider. And then the College Music Society. These were a great bunch of people, because they talk about music and teaching it. So I felt like I fitted right in. Although they didn't accept my papers for the first 3 conferences I went to. So perhaps I don't fit in. They were very friendly. Then there's the National Association of Music Education in America. And I just submitted a paper to them with a very famous colleague, so maybe it'll be accepted. I don't know. They kind of can't not accept his paper, so we'll see what happens. I came up with a perfect solution, if I dare say so. I decided to organise my own conference in my institution. It's this, and I'm organising it, chairing it, and it's just a chance for everybody else to come to my college and feel a bit comfortable about how they fit in, essentially. And I know exactly what it's about, because these are all my areas of specialty. How I interpret them. Just a few pictures of the places I went to, because it was quite good fun. When I went to Tampa, after I'd done the conference, I hired this Pontiac G5 and went for a nice long drive up the east coast of Florida. It was really noisy and a bit fast and great fun. And the road looked like this for a whole day. Then, last summer I got to go to Beijing, which was very cool, and I saw that. And also found some drums, which made it a bonus. Just before that, went to Cairo, found some drummers there too. Look, drummers, fantastic. And also, just the day after I got back from Cairo, I had to give a presentation here at the MA Music Education Masters Seminar thing. A study day, that's what it was. But I got to prepare, this is the same laptop, look, just here. Same background, in fact, but I was sitting in a cafe overlooking the Nile, and it felt great. It was much better than being at home, being distracted. So, then I was at a presentation in Limerick, in Ireland, for the sociology conference. But because my punk band has its headquarters and recording studio in rural Cork, the bass player came and picked me up straight from the sociology conference, straight to do 4 days of rock in that barn. And it was great. If you like punk, if you don't, it was terrible. But I loved it, it was great fun. It was the kind of antithesis of the sociology conference. And very expensive, because apparently Ryanair don't like you taking double bass drum pedals and 8 cymbals on their flights. It was worth it. So my favourite place I ended up going to was in South Dakota. I went to the Pine Ridge Reservation. I had this conference in Minnesota. I thought that Minnesota was okay, but I decided to drive for 16 hours west and see where I came to, and it was the middle of nowhere. I ended up in Nebraska and drove a couple of hours north in the morning after a very interesting motel, and ended up here, which was great. I found Wounded Knee, which I've read a book about, very interesting and coloured history. And this is the best part. I drove up to the Badlands National Park, this was the weekend after I'd handed in my thesis. I handed the thing in, and you know how intense it is, the whole thing. I just drove out here, absolutely middle of nowhere, parked the car, and you could see nothing and hear nothing for hundreds of miles. It was incredible. It was awesome. So then I got back in the car. I got a bit scared since there was no one around. I got a very small Mazda, but I put Led Zeppelin on, who saw me through, and for the next 6 hours I drove home. Still, I'm not sure quite who I am or where I fit in, but it's all working out okay. So thank you very much for your time.